Welcome to Racers360.com. My name's Mike Edwards, and we're going to talk about riding a lap of the circuit Barcelona-Catalunya in Spain. Catalunya is one of the most iconic MotoGP F1 circuits in Europe and is truly fantastic to ride. I've been there several times and really enjoy it. To help with the guide, I'm also going to drop in some circuit diagrams and maps on which I show the racing line, and the line is in different colours. Red showing braking, orange part throttle, yellow closed throttle, and green acceleration. And there's also some arrows to indicate apexes and general points of interest. Okay, the circuit itself is, as I say, it's an awesome track. It's 2.8 miles around, has 12 corners, and a large percentage of the corners are really long radius. Some of them are multi-apex corners, which can create either two apexes or you try and link them together. But the sheer radius and the speed of them are quite spectacular. There's also a certain amount of elevation in the circuit, which does create a few blind approaches to some corners and kind of hides a few of the apexes from time to time. So we'll talk about them as they come around. The video starts here with us on the start-finish straight running down towards turn 1. It is one of the fastest circuits in Europe, and it allows superbikes to really stretch the legs, and you'll be approaching on a stock machine between 185 to 190 miles an hour, close to the top speed of the bike, to be fair. And 600s are the same. They'll be pretty much flat out at the end of the straight. So it's an awesome track. The elevation does in fact start towards the end of the start-finish straight. It does start to drop off slightly down into turn 1, which creates even more of an issue when it comes to trying to get the thing hauled up in time. So let's get the video moving off down to turn 1, down to through the start-finish area, and we'll start looking at braking reference areas and where we should be on the track, etc. So we're off down. Keep the bike generally over towards the left-hand side as you're approaching the braking area. And as you come past the end of the pit wall and the large signage here, you're approaching the 400-metre mark. So this is giving us a bit of a clue that turn 1 is approaching. Keep the bike over to the left. And I would suggest, if it's your, certainly if it's your first time there, start braking somewhere just before the 300-metre mark. And as your confidence and ability grows and knowledge of the circuit, you can start to edge up towards the 200-metre mark. Realistically though, if you're riding say a 1,000 stock machine, you're not going to get much beyond 200 metres and get the thing stopped in time. Because you've got to obviously, remember, you've got to enter the corner as opposed to just screech to a halt. Keep the bike over to the left. On the dashboard of the BMW I'm riding here, you can see there's a blue light, and when that's solid, that indicates braking. With the canvas system on the BMW, it does flicker, so when it's flickering, it's just showing that the light is there. When it goes solid, that's we're in the braking zone then. So I started to brake around about the 250 mark, really hard. Keep the bike over to the left-hand side, and things to start looking for here is your peeling point or your tipping point. Now, what I would suggest is right over towards the end of the pit lane wall here is an orange section of wall. Now, the walls generally around the outside of the circuit are white, and where you see an orange section, that's a break in the wall to allow you, if you do break down or whatever, to get the other side of the wall. They're an access point. So as you start to see this access point, that gives you an indication of where on the left-hand side of the track where we should start to tip into the corner. Let's get rid of that. As we get closer to the corner, we're just coming up to the end of the wall here where the orange marker is. And as you can see, the bike's still on full brakes, and we're starting to ease the bike in towards the corner. Now, turn 1 is essentially a sharpish right second gear, about 65 miles an hour, something like that. And that leads straight away into a left, which is slightly more open. You're up to about 70, 75 miles an hour, but it's effectively a chicane. So what you've got to try here is when you run into the corner is not to go too quickly and then use all of the track out to the left. The apex of the right-hander here is approximately where the arrow is now. and the other apex of turn 2 is quite a way around the corner. So on our way into the corner, we're looking for the apex, and you can still keep braking really hard as you're tipping in towards the corner, trailing the brake off progressively. And roughly halfway from your tipping point towards the apex, release the brake and allow the bike to run in towards the apex. Now, it's quite handy. The curbs, by the way, are fairly usable, generally speaking, and they're quite wide and broad. And there's also the other side of the red and white curb is this green section. Now, that isn't great to be on. It's quite rough and not grippy, so stay off it. And the apexes of a lot of the corners have these large raised sections of red and white curbs. The idea of them is to keep the cars off the curbs, because the cars tend to grab quite a bit of curb going around the corner. But ideally for the bikes, it gives you a good indication or a reference point more than anything else of where the apex of the corner is. So after we've got past this point, which is the apex, you can start to pick the throttle up, running out into more or less the middle of the track between the two apexes. And our second apex now at turn 2 is approximately there. And again, when we get there, you'll see there's another small raised section there. Now, because this radius is slightly more open than the one we've gone round, you can accelerate as the bike's coming upright. And then as the bike starts to go over to the left here, you need to ease back on the throttle without closing it, but you can't keep on accelerating all the way around this left. But ideally, try and keep on the throttle so you're making good progress. And as you start to drift out into the drift out curve here, because straight away now we go around another turn, turn 3, which is a huge long radius corner, really quick. And as it comes to the end, starts to open out, so it gets quicker and quicker as we go around the corner. But because of the radius, it's really difficult to see where the apex of this corner is. Now, if you do run out of this corner and you run right out to the right-hand curb, you're compromising your entry into this next corner, turn 3. But it's not worth us, in reality, trying to get over to the left to immediately have to get back towards an apex further around the corner. So I would suggest when you do come out of this left, aim for about the middle of the track, and that's the optimum position. You've compromised both corners a little bit, but you gain best overall. And carry on accelerating until the bike starts to get in towards the corner itself. Again, don't shut the throttle here, kind of roll back off the acceleration, keep up as much momentum as possible so that you can maintain your line around the corner. If you ease back on the throttle here, the bike will fall in towards the curb. And if you carry on trying to accelerate, you'll either run out of ground clearance because you'll run out of angled lean, or the bike's just going to run offline. So drive up to this corner to a pace that you know that you can hold the line and maintain that pace going round the corner. Now, as I say, it's a really long corner. When you look at the overhead circuit maps, you'll see what I'm talking about. And what we're actually looking for here is on this right-hand wall here, we're looking for a section of orange. And as we see that point, and it's coming up shortly, there it is there. As we see that orange section on the end of the wall there, that's the indication for us to now start to accelerate and develop the throttle out the corner. Now, as you can see, I'm about halfway out in the track here. It doesn't make a huge amount of difference. I've been gradually trying to build up as much throttle as I can here, and it's pushed me slightly offline. But from now, you'll see the tacho start to make revs, which means I'm starting to accelerate. As we're leaving the corner, we're passing the exit point, and the revs are building up. That shows acceleration. And we're coming onto a short straight, which will take us up to turn 4. Now, because of the width of the track, and it is wide and very smooth, Barcelona, some of the corners have very high corner entry speeds as well. So that's something you have to take on board. The reference points, there's plenty of them to go at, to be fair. And your braking references, apart from the countdown markers, which to the left here are quite a long way off the circuit, but you can see these white lines, and these are roughly every 100 meters or 100 yards approximately apart, and they give you a good reference for your braking. So there's 3 on the left coming up here, and we usually brake just before the second one. So that's the first one, there, and there's the second one. And keep the bike over to the left-hand side until we're going under the gantry. Now, we're coming up to another long right-hand corner, not quite as open as the turn 3, and it tends to sort of nip up slightly mid-corner, so it's not a complete smooth radius. And it's a tricky corner to get right. The mistake a lot of people make on this particular corner is overreacting and going into the corner too early, which creates an obvious early apex, and it completely ruins the rest and particularly the exit. That's what I'm suggesting, is wait till you're under the bridge before you start to tip into the corner. And it opens the entrance up into the corner and creates ultimately a higher entry speed and corner speed. So as we're on our way into the corner, we're still on hard brakes. Hang on to the brakes till you start to close in on the curb. Because of the radius of the corner, it's very difficult to, as I say, pick an apex. So what I tend to do is running as the sort of the corner itself has just started. I'm roughly halfway out in the track, closing in on the apex. And I'm imagining now the actual true apex of the corner for me is the last part of the curb at the exit. Now, at this point, you can't even see it. It's probably well over 300 meters round the corner. At this point, I'm still braking. And even after I've released the brake, I keep the throttle closed to allow the bike to do some turning and closing on the curb. But because of the duration of the corner, at some point you have to pick up the throttle and maintain a constant throttle just to keep your momentum up going around the corner. Because of the length of the corner, it's impossible to close the throttle to a point that you can accelerate and drive from, more like a tighter corner, which is more easy to do. And what we're effectively looking, as we continue to maintain the throttle around here, is we're looking for this parapet. Now, on the video, it's not terribly obvious, but you can actually see that from about just over halfway around the corner. It's just over the wall there. Well, as soon as you can see that, that's where you start your acceleration and continue to close in on the right-hand curb. And as we come towards the end of the curb, you start to let it go and then use this gantry here as your drift out reference, because you can't in fact see the drift out curb because of the camber of the corner until you're almost there. So you imagine as we're coming up to that gantry, that's going to be your drift out point in the distance. And by now we're accelerating full gas out towards that point. So that's turn 4 out the way. We're now approaching turn 5. Now turn 5 is a tricky little corner. It's very easy to go in there too hot. It's probably the slowest corner on the circuit. You're right down to second gear, possibly first, depending if you're running stock gearing on the bike, but it's certainly second gear on most machines. And we need to get our bike over from the left over to the right. So keep turning right, and we're aiming for over towards, you can't quite see it at this point, the end of the tipping curb is probably about where my arrow is there. So that's what we're aiming to get our bike over towards. But we want to ideally get it over there before that point so we can do some braking with the bike in a more of an upright position. So keep your eye on the brake light, and as we're making our way out there, we're still crossing the track when we come onto the braking area. So we're in the braking area now, and it coincides once again with one of these orange sections, which is an access point for us. So you can utilize that as your braking reference, but our aim point is still over here. And we're getting the bike over here. Now that you can see there's slightly darker sections of tarmac here. And this is the only part of the track which is what I would describe as bumpy. It's more like ripples in the track where the cars under heavy braking kind of push the tarmac, and it's a little bit ripply. And it can unsettle the bike. So you just need to be aware of that while you're approaching that point. Now, this corner isn't exactly 180 degrees. It's probably about 160, something like that. So it's pretty tight, pretty long, but the radius isn't huge, so it's quite slow. But realistically, we're looking a long way around the corner for our apex, which is all the way around there. So we've got to get in and round the corner. But because of the bumps, and we're going to be tipping in with our brakes still on, of course, what I would suggest is as we're going into the corner from our tip-in point, which is, I don't know, 10 meters from the end of the red and white curb on the right there, by the time we reach the halfway point in the track, which is, I would suggest, is somewhere about here in the track, by the time we get to that point, we realistically want to finish our braking. and allow the bike on a closed throttle just to turn in towards the apex. Generally, the bike will turn in better once you get beyond a certain angle of lean with just a closed throttle. If you have the bike on its side and you start to brake, it's going to try and sit up a little bit. So ideally, trail the brake off by that point and then zero brakes and let the bike turn in towards the apex. And as I said, the apex is a long way around the corner. So we're currently looking right the way up here. So vision is quite important at that point. Apex is a little tricky to find here because there isn't, this is one of the corners where there isn't an apex lump to work on. So you'll really need to pick something out on the day. The reference points are quite sparse at this particular corner, but you'll get an idea of it. And one of those is to start to visualize where you need to get the bike to as you drift out reference. And the drift out curve is still a long way around the corner, but we want to be looking up as far as we can see at this point. And that's where we want to aim the bike for. Always try and look where you want to go as opposed to where the bike's physically pointing. So let's get a little bit further around the corner. Now the drift out curb here is one of the few curbs where it's not a good idea to use because it's extremely bumpy, and particularly the green section. So if you do run onto the red and white curb here, it isn't too bad, but definitely stay off the green section. We're going slightly downhill. Most of the circuit so far has been relatively flat. We're running slightly downhill, and in front of us is the start-finish podiums and so on. So we're going to end up running effectively behind the back of the pits. It's a very fast drop down under the section, and there's a gantry here we're going to go under. And we're coming into what is effectively another relatively slow left-right chicane. A little bit faster than the corner we've just gone round, but the approach speed is quite dramatic. So accelerate really hard down towards the chicane. And once again, we're looking for the end of this white wall here. We're looking for an orange section, which is an access point. That's the closest we want to get to the corner where we need to start braking. And we actually come across over to the left-hand side of the track a little. You don't particularly have to be touching the curb at that point, but use some of the track here, certainly more than half. You don't want to be running around the outside of this corner. It's effectively a corner, even though it's a kink, because that means you'll have a bigger angle of lean when it comes to slowing down. So we're trying to straighten this section up as much as we can. And use this orange section of wall as your braking reference as well. What we're actually aiming for now is the middle of this drift out curb, red and white drift out curb in the distance. And because we've come across into the middle of the track, we can sit the bike up ever so slightly. And from here, we can effectively brake more or less in a straight line to that point. If we're, for instance, further out to the right, dropping down this hill, we're going to have to brake effectively round a slight bend, which isn't as efficient as braking in a straight line. So heavy on the brakes, let the bike run out to the middle of the curb. This is the lowest section of the circuit. And from here, through the left and the right, and then up the hill to turn 8, it's basically uphill. So we've got turn 6 and 7 here, and then up to turn 8. More or less, as soon as you reach this curb, still braking heavy, what I would suggest is start your tipping into the corner. Ideally, you want to try and create a relatively late apex here, and that will help to pay off benefits to get you up the hill and through the chicane better. But it's a bit of a trade-off because it's a left-right chicane. If you go around this corner really fast, you're going to end up completely over to the right and then ruin your exit to the left. If you go in too slow here, you're going to run into issues with people getting underneath you. Okay, you can exit the corner very fast, but that means you compromise your entrance. So it's a compromise either way. So get us into this corner. Again, the apex of the corner isn't terribly obvious to see. Round about here somewhere, you'll need to pick up something. It can be like marks, like on the track like this, which work for you on the day. And then what we're now doing is we're now looking up the track for our next apex. Now, as I said, you can use the curbs here. I wouldn't suggest to use the curbs on the way into corners, or certainly apex on the curbs. When you're leaving and you're accelerating, running on the curbs then isn't too much of an issue. However, the curb here, if you take too much of the curb running across it, it upsets the bike too much. So there's an element of use some of the curb, but not too much. So once you've got the bike to the apex, pick the throttle up, start your acceleration, a rapid change of direction. You can run across some of the curb. Definitely stay off this, because this here is AstroTurf, which is a soft nylon material, extremely slippy in any condition. So just stay off it. And there's a small dip in the red and white curb here, which is a drainage where it rains. So just stay on this part of the red and white curb if you're going to use the curbs at all. And then carry on your acceleration up the hill. It's not a steep hill, but it's significant in the sense that as we're approaching turn 8, it's only a short amount of braking, not long after we've gone under this gantry. And as we're coming towards the end of the red and white curb here, we are effectively trying to imagine our apex, which is quite a long way around the corner there. And our drift out curb is so far around the corner we can't even see it. It's a long way around the corner. So our focus is arriving at the apex as fast as possible, yet manage that we can actually get there. Because of the hill, more or less as soon as you finish your braking on the way into the corner, pick up the throttle to maintain your pace. And as we close in on the apex, there's one of those large red and white lumpy sections to keep the cars off the green curb. And that's an ideal reference for us. We're then looking for this gantry here. The gantry is a really good reference because of the hill, and we're creating a rise that we can't see over. So we're in fact looking in the distance, maybe 50 meters after the gantry is our drift out curb. So we're looking under the gantry there in the distance for our drift out point. But it's ideal. The gantries are very good to use because as we're coming up to that point, we can start to see it as we're closing in on the apex. So you can take your eye off the apex as you close onto that point and then get your vision up there to see where we want to go. Don't be looking in the distance because that's where you're going to end up if you're not careful. So as we're cresting the rise, the circuit starts to open out down another long straight down towards the stadium section, and jumping out in front of you comes the red and white curb and the green drift out curb. This line, ironically, is a perfect point to actually reach the curb by, which is, as I say, is maybe 50 meters or maybe a bit less after the gantry. And then it's a flat out run down towards the stadium section. So we've got turn 9 and 10 to deal with, the last part of the circuit. We're looking for approximately 150 meter mark as your braking reference, or the orange access points on the white wall. They're ideal to use as reference points. Keep the bike once again over to the right-hand side of the track, and we'll come into a really long loopy section. Now here, if you look at the aerial map, it shows there's another part of the track which goes off here, which is a lot the cars tend to use, where the bikes tend to run on round a long looping corner where the cars have two sharp left-hand corners. It can confuse your eye, and we'll talk about it a bit later because turn 11 has a similar thing, which it's a little confusing at this point. But keep the bike, your eyes are kind of drawn to this part of the track here because of the wear mark on the track here. It kind of wants to suck you in, but your apex is after this painted section here. Our tipping point is maybe 10 yards or something like that from the end of this red and white curb, and you can see this tarmac mark in the track here. That's the perfect point to kind of turn away from as you're about to run over that. Still hanging onto the brakes and start to close in on the right-hand curb, easing back on the brakes. And the first of these apexes, because this is a multi-apex corner, is the red and white marking, and it's actually the name of the circuit which is written on the curb here. You can't read it because you're that close, but you'll see it from the aerial shot. And where the name meets the edge of the track, that's where our first apex is. And on a closed throttle here, you can still run into the corner hot enough, and if necessary, you've gone in maybe a bit hot, you can run out to maybe half or 3/4 out in the track and then come back in for a second and much later apex as you pick the throttle up and slowly develop the throttle, as you can see by the tacho, round the corner and up towards turn 10. The second apex is towards the end of this long red and white curb here, And it's a case of hanging on to it for as long as you can. But because you're actually accelerating, the bike's being pushed out, and pushed out. And you've got to try and hang on to that curb and maybe ease back ever so slightly on not exactly full throttle. But you've got to get it stopped now for turn 10. Now, this is another corner where a huge amount of compromise comes into play. Ideally, we want to be, as we're approaching this corner, right over on the left-hand side of the track to open this entry up into this corner. But to do that is so difficult and maintain a good rate of knots around this corner. So what I tend to find is if I'm passing this open section here where the cars would turn out here, as the bike's coming in the upright position, that's roughly our braking point. And if you can be approximately in the middle of the track at that point, you're doing well. But because of the long, and this is another huge long 180-degree corner, it doesn't make a huge amount of difference if you're right over on the left-hand side of the track or in the middle here. So the middle is the much easier one to get. And hang on to that brake until you're well into the corner and you can maintain your line around this corner. As soon as you finish your braking, pick up the throttle to maintain that pace going around the corner. Once again, roughly the halfway point, you can see this red and white bump on the green curb. That's the halfway point. So after you've passed that point, once that's gone out the corner of your vision, start to pick your throttle up and start to develop it out of the corner. Now at this point, we're looking right the way down here. Our next aim point is way down here because the corner actually finishes at that first arrow, but we're actually looking down there because that's where we want to ultimately get to. So gradually build the throttle up here, and as the end of the curve comes into view here, you should now be driving quite hard. And the drift out curve, because you've crested a rise and you're now starting to drop down again, and you're effectively going over an ever such a slight rise. So this drift out curve on the left here, keep your eye on this wall because that gives you a fair indication, particularly because of this next orange section, of where you need to get the bike to, ready for turn 11. As you can see, we're just passing that orange section where we start to tip the bike in. So as we're leaving turn 10, we're leaving the end of the curve there, we're using this orange as our aim point. The drift out curve comes into view. Hang on to that for a while, a short burst of throttle, really hard acceleration, then off the throttle and a light brake into this corner. Turn 11 is a really tricky corner, mainly because this is, as you're approaching it, you see this curb here. Now, your eye focuses in on that, and it's very easy to get sucked into the corner using that as an imaginary apex. However, it isn't. As you start to ease in towards the corner, trailer brake in a little bit, and as you start to close in on what is the apex, you can see now this is where the cars actually turn in. So that curb there, which is raised for the car, that's why it's so easy to see. But the bike corner in the old circuit, if you will, you have to use this non-raised section, which as we're tipping into the corner is virtually out of view. So this corner is one of the most difficult in the sense it's a straightforward corner. It's just under 90 degrees. It's quite fast, but you're dropping down a slight rise, which creates that blind spot at the apex, which is particularly difficult to spot. So as we're closing in on it, as soon as you realise where it is, pick the throttle up to maintain the pace and then accelerate out onto the short straight, which takes us down towards the last corner. You can grab a lot of curb here and it's not a problem at all. And I tend to run on the curb most of the way down. Now we're approaching the last corner, so it's a quick squeeze of brakes. And this is where, if you needed to, round in the last corner, you keep over to the right and you can run off into the pits there. So that's the pit lane. So we're now looking for our next apex, which it's a fairly long corner onto the start-finish straight, and the apex is behind these trees. So it's quite a long way around the corner. So after you've done a certain amount of braking, where the raised section of curb in here, what the cars, when the cars come out the chicane, to stop them running over that section, they've raised that curb. So we can utilise that as a tipping point for us to get us into the last corner. But as that's coming into your view, the end of it, start to ease the bike over, still braking at this point, trailing it off by this white line, still closing in. And now the apex for us is the end of this pit wall here. That is effectively our apex. It's a long way around the corner, as I say, and you can't even see it at all when you're approaching the corner. So you've got to visualize where it is, closing in on it. And as we get fairly close to the end of the pit wall here, that's a good time then, as you can see the grandstands in the distance. And that's where we start to pick up our throttle and try to visualize our drift out point, passing our apex, picking the throttle up, and develop the throttle out onto the straight. Once again, the drift out curve on the left here, nice broad curve, so you can use it, grab a bit of that if you need to. And then we're up onto the straight and down through the start finish area. The finish line, this is where the guy sits with his flag, and as you can see, the finish line is just here. And then it's a long run down to turn 1 again. This is what it looks like at regular speed. Hope you've enjoyed the ride, and thanks for visiting Racers360.com.